As the rain stopped and the wind started to die down, all the lights suddenly went out. In the darkness of the cabin, Alice gasped and reached out quickly, grabbing Bill's arm and squeezing it convulsively. "It's all right," Bill said, putting his arm around her and giving her a squeeze. "It's all right. Don't worry. I'll get the lamps." He left her standing in the main room of the cabin and went into the kitchen to get a couple of kerosene lamps. He brought them in and set them on a table, then struck a match and lit a candle so he could see what he was doing. Alice stood, holding herself tensely while he lit the lamps. "What do you think happened?" she said, in a small voice. "I don't know," said Bill. "The generator's probably out of gas. I'll go check it." "You want me to come with you?" she asked anxiously, afraid of going outside, but more afraid of being left alone. He shook his head and led her to the couch. "Why don't you stay here and try to get some sleep? I'll be right back." He gently eased her down and covered her with a blanket. She stared up at him, eyes wide, lips trembling slightly. Whatever was going on, he thought. It had long since passed the joke stage. It wasn't funny anymore. Alice was genuinely frightened, but he remained convinced that the others were behind this. The generator might have run out of gas, or they might have turned it off, just playing games. Maybe Ned put them up to this, he thought. It was just the sort of juvenile prank that he would pull, and Brenda would probably have gone along with it. But Jack and Marcy seemed to have a lot more sense than to pull something this stupid. They had probably all gone off and smoked somewhere, got silly, and decided to play a practical joke. Hide and seek. Ghosts and monsters in the dark. Kid stuff. But the laughter stopped when someone got as scared as Alice did, especially that bit with the bloody axe in Brenda's bed. It was probably red paint. He hadn't stopped to check. It had actually scared him a little too. Sick, he thought. Really sick. He had half a mind to deck Nettie when he found them, and Steve wouldn't be amused by this at all. Unlike Alice, he knew why the people in the town called the place Camp Blood. When he had first arrived, he had stopped in for breakfast at the general store in Crystal Lake and struck up a conversation with one of the locals who had told him all about the drowning in 1957, the murders in 1958, and everything that had happened since, every time the Christies had tried to reopen the camp. At first, Bill hadn't really believed him. He had worked as a camp counselor every summer for the last 5 years, and he'd heard every single summer camp ghost story there was to hear. Most of them were all variations on the same theme. A tired classic told around the campfire late at night. The story of the Hook. There was a homicidal maniac who had killed a lot of people and had been locked up in an asylum for the criminally insane. This asylum always just happened to be somewhere not far from the camp. The killer, so the story went, had lost his hand, and in its place he had a steel hook. The hand was never found. The killer had lost it somewhere nearby in the woods, and he was obsessed with finding it. By this time, if you paced the story right and described some of the killer's murders in particularly gruesome detail, the campers would all be sitting wide-eyed around the fire, hanging on your every word. A lot of people thought it was just a story you'd tell the campers. At least, the storyteller would go on to say, "That's what a couple of the counselors who worked here last year thought." Until the night they sneaked off in a car, driving to a deserted country road not far away. They had parked the car beneath some trees and turned the lights out. as they were sitting there making out and listening to the radio. The girl thought she heard something just outside the car. A twig snapping, a footstep, a little scratching noise, as if someone was touching the door handle with something made of metal. She got scared all of a sudden and insisted that they leave, drive off right away, and the guy she was with caught the mood from her and started up the car and floored it, peeling out. It was only later, when they were driving back into the camp, right down that very road there, and the storyteller would point at the road leading into the camp, that they'd relaxed and started laughing about it, feeling foolish for getting so carried away and letting their imaginations get the better of them. And as they were getting out of the car, something clinked against the car door, and there, hanging from the door handle, was a steel hook. And then you dropped the bombshell. Earlier that night, you'd tell them you had heard on the radio that the killer had escaped from the insane asylum and the state police had set up roadblocks and were combing the woods looking for him. They had issued a warning to the people in the area to stay indoors because the man was highly dangerous, a maniac, an animal, and he had last been seen in the vicinity of... fill in the name of the camp. "He's looking for his hook," you'd tell them, in a very low voice. That very same hook that he lost last year when he tried to kill those counselors and they'd just barely managed to escape in time. "He's convinced the hook is here," you'd continue, "right here in this camp. And in fact, those 2 counselors last year had left it here. It's really been here all along, and the killer knows it. He knows it's here, and he knows we have it, and he won't rest until he gets it back." And you'd quickly reach into your jacket and pull out a steel hook and hold it up for everyone to see. It worked best if you had taken some polish to it and really shined it up so that it would gleam in the firelight. And it worked even better if you daubed some paint on the end and sprinkled it with dirt so it looked like dried blood where it had been ripped from the killer's stump. "First, he lost his hand," you'd tell them, pausing dramatically as you turned the hook slowly so it caught the firelight. "And now he's lost his hook. And what's more, he knows we have it. And now that he's escaped..." And at that moment, on cue, somebody would come leaping out of the darkness, screaming like a maniac, wearing a mask or a pillowcase with eye holes cut in it. He'd have one hand pulled up inside his sleeve so it looked like a stump, and in the other hand he'd be holding a large knife, or maybe an axe, or a machete, and he'd jump on top of you, screaming horribly, and wrestle you to the ground. If you screamed enough, it usually scared the campers out of at least 10 years' growth. He had seen and heard a vast number of variations on that theme. Every summer camp had its own version, like a timed, honored tradition. He had thought this camp blood thing with the drowning and the murders and the fires was just another version of the same old story, but the guy he had talked to back in town had seemed quite serious about it. And now, despite his conviction that Nettie and the others were just doing a number on them, he felt a tightness in his stomach as he walked down the muddy path to the utility cabin to check the generator. They had to be around here someplace, he thought. There were only 2 vehicles. Steve had taken the Jeep, and Nettie's pickup was still there. They had tried to start it, but the distributor or the plugs must have been wet or something. Nettie would be pissed as hell when he found the ignition wires torn loose. But it would serve him right. "They're here," thought Bill. "They have to be. They couldn't have walked all the way into town in the storm. It was at least 10 miles. Once he got the generator working again, He was going to make a cabin-by-cabin search, including the boathouse by the dock. When he found them, he had a good mind to toss them all into the lake. Goddamn juvenile nonsense. He opened the door to the utility cabin and hung the lamp on a hook just above the generator. He took off his slicker and dropped it on the floor, then unscrewed the gas cap on the generator's fuel tank, picked up the yardstick, and stuck it in the tank. He pulled it out and held it close to the lamp. "Full of gas," he muttered to himself. They had probably just turned it off. He bent down to check the switch. "I'm going to kill them," he thought. "Somebody's going to die." Alice woke with a scream. "Bill!" She sat up on the couch, breathing hard, not knowing what had awakened her. She didn't remember dropping off to sleep. "Bill?" The thought of being left alone unsettled her. First Nettie disappears, then Jack and Marcy, and then Brenda, and now Bill. "The generator," she sighed as she remembered that he had gone to check it. But he should have been back by now, and the lights were still out. Maybe there was something wrong, a loose wire or something, and he was working on it. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, then picked up the other lantern and went into the kitchen to put on a pot of tea. What the hell was going on? Where was everybody? Steve still wasn't back. Maybe he'd decided to stay in town until the storm blew over. Maybe he got stuck on the road. But where were Jack and Marcy, and Nettie, and Brenda? Well, maybe they'd all paired off as she had thought, and were in some of the other cabins having their own parties. But they had checked the cabins, at least the ones where the counselors were staying, and there was no sign of them. She didn't feel like checking the other cabins in the dark by herself. Besides, Bill had probably already done that. Maybe he'd even found them and given them all a piece of his mind. He was convinced that this was all a joke, but she didn't find it very funny. They'd probably all be coming in any time now, laughing about how they'd scared her half to death. What time was it, anyway? It had to be the middle of the night. She wished Bill would hurry back. She wished Steve would get back from town. She wished somebody, anybody, would come. Being alone was giving her the creeps. She put on her slicker and picked up the lantern, then went outside, taking the path down to the utility cabin. It was pitch dark outside. She could barely see a thing. She held the lantern high, picking her way carefully along the path. "Bill? Bill?" There was no answer. "Bill?" She shouted louder. "Bill?" God, she thought, this is all I need. Where was everybody disappearing to? "Bill!" The door to the utility cabin was open. The light was on. "Bill?" There was no one inside. A slicker lay crumpled on the floor. She picked it up. It was still wet. It had to be Bill's. Where was he? "Bill?" She stepped outside and started to close the door. It felt strangely heavy. Bill was hanging on the door, blood running down his face and chest. His throat was slashed. There was an arrow stuck in his eye. Another arrow pierced his neck, and several more were rammed into his body, plunged in after he had been hung up, driven in so deeply and so hard that they had gone straight through him and into the wooden door. Alice screamed, bringing her hands up to her face and backing away from the awful sight in disbelief. "Pew!" She grabbed the lantern and ran, sobbing, back to the main cabin. The terrifying knowledge of what had happened to the others overwhelmed her. She ran through the door and slammed it shut, searching wildly for some way to secure it. She spotted a length of rope and picked it up, tossing one end over a rafter and pulling it tight, then tying it to the doorknob so the door could not be pulled open. Sobbing hysterically, she searched for something to barricade the door. She ran over to the windows and pulled the curtains shut, then picked up a large fireplace log and set it in front of the door. Not heavy enough. She grabbed a trunk and dragged it over, then a chair, piling things up in front of the door, half out of her mind with fear. A weapon. She had to find a weapon, something to protect herself. She grabbed a baseball bat in one hand and clutched the lantern in the other, trying to catch her breath, trying desperately to think straight. But all she could see was Bill's body hanging on the door, transfixed by arrows and covered with blood. She started to hyperventilate. She ran into the kitchen and set the lantern on a table, then rummaged through the shelves. She pulled down a barbecue fork and readied herself to stab with it, still gripping the baseball bat in the other hand. She stood in the center of the room, looking all around, expecting the killer to come bursting through the door at any moment. She swallowed hard and tried to control her breathing. Her heart was pounding. My God, she thought. They're dead. They're all dead. I'm the only one left. What am I going to do? She glanced out the kitchen window, then quickly closed the curtains and leaned against the refrigerator, sobbing and gasping for breath. Suddenly, the kitchen window shattered in a rain of glass as Brenda's body crashed through it, hurled from outside by someone with incredible strength. Alice recoiled from the window, screaming. Brenda's corpse fell onto the kitchen floor like a sack. It was pierced with arrows and caked with blood. Blood on her face and neck. Blood everywhere. And she was tied tightly with rough rope. Tied so her arms were against her sides to prevent them from flopping around. "Brenda!" Alice whimpered. She sank to her hands and knees and crawled around the body, away from the window, sobbing uncontrollably. She crawled to the center of the room, backed up against the stove and leaned against it, rising unsteadily to her feet, thinking only that she had to get away. She had to run. But where? The killer was outside that very cabin, and she could block the door. But there was no way to block the windows, no way to watch all of them at once. She tried to run back to the main room, but something caught hold of her jacket. Terror-stricken, she fought against the pull, convinced that the killer had somehow gotten inside. She turned and saw that the jacket had caught on the oven door. She shrugged out of it and ran into the main room, then realized she had dropped the baseball bat in the kitchen. She stood in the center of the room, glancing wildly from window to window, unable to force herself to go back in the kitchen. And then she saw approaching headlights. Steve. She started to pull down her barricade, sobbing with relief. "Steve!" she screamed. "Steve!" She struggled with the knot on the rope securing the door, her fingers working spastically. Finally, it was loose and she tore it away, threw open the door, and went running out toward the headlights of the Jeep, crying hysterically, shouting Steve's name over and over again. She heard the car door slam and saw a figure step out of the Jeep, silhouetted in the glare of the headlights. "Steve!" Steve!" she cried, running up to him. It wasn't Steve.